January 15, 1945. The sky over Nazi-occupied Germany was a frozen battlefield, painted in shades of steel and smoke. At 23,000 feet, American P-47 Thunderbolt pilot Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was about to experience what would later be called the most impossible aerial escape in World War II history. His radio crackled with static as he completed his bombing run over a critical German supply depot near Cologne. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: get in, drop the payload, get out. But war never follows the script. As Johnson banked his massive fighter to the west, heading back toward Allied lines, his heart nearly stopped. 11 German Bf-109 fighters were screaming toward him in perfect attack formation, their wings glinting like knives in the winter sun. He was alone. His squadron had been scattered during the initial attack. His fuel gauge showed he had maybe 40 minutes of flight time left. And now, 11 of Germany's most experienced pilots were about to turn him into another statistic, another name on a memorial wall back home in Michigan. But what happened next would defy every principle of aerial combat, every assumption about what was physically possible in a P-47 Thunderbolt, and would leave German radio operators stammering in disbelief as their ace pilots reported something that shouldn't have been happening. This is the story of how one American pilot turned physics, courage, and a 7-ton beast of an aircraft into a legend that still echoes through aviation history today. Before we dive into this absolutely insane story, do me a huge favor and smash that subscribe button right now. I'm Wasim Rind, and on this channel, we bring you the most incredible, verified, and downright unbelievable stories from World War II that somehow got lost in history. We're talking about the moments that make you question everything you thought you knew about human capability and courage. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because you're not going to want to miss what comes next. Trust me, this story gets absolutely wild. The setup and initial engagement. Let me take you back to understand exactly how desperate this situation was. Robert Johnson wasn't some rookie fresh out of flight school. By January 1945, he had 27 confirmed kills to his name and was considered one of the top American fighter aces in the European theater. He knew his aircraft inside and out. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster, the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war. It weighed 7 tons when fully loaded, which was more than some bombers. Most pilots called it the Jug because it looked like a milk jug with wings. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't nimble, but it was tough as nails, and it could take punishment that would shred any other fighter into confetti. Johnson had proven that multiple times, nursing damaged Thunderbolts back to base when other pilots would have bailed out. But toughness wasn't going to save him today. He needed speed, he needed altitude, and he needed a miracle. The German fighters approaching him were Bf-109G models, the latest and deadliest variant of the Luftwaffe's premier fighter. These weren't defensive patrol pilots protecting their homeland. These were Jagdgeschwader veterans, men who had survived years of combat against American and British fighters. Their radios were already coordinating the attack. In intercepted transmissions that Allied intelligence would later analyze, the German flight leader's voice was confident, almost casual. They had done this hundreds of times before. One Allied fighter, 11 German hunters. The math was simple. The outcome was inevitable. They split into 2 groups. One would attack from above and behind, forcing Johnson to dive. The second group would wait below, ready to intercept when he tried to escape downward. It was a classic hammer and anvil tactic. There was no escape route. Johnson's only option was to fight, and fighting meant dying. Because even if he shot down 2 or 3 of them, the others would rip him apart while he was focused on the first targets. His hands tightened on the control stick. His breathing steadied. And then, he did something that the German pilots weren't expecting. Instead of diving away or trying to run, Johnson pushed his throttle to maximum war emergency power and pointed the nose of his Thunderbolt straight up into the sky. The P-47's massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine roared like a caged animal finally released. 2,400 horsepower channeled through a 4-bladed propeller big enough to use as a dining table. The Thunderbolt didn't just climb, it rocketed upward with an acceleration that pressed Johnson back into his seat. The German pilots watched in confusion as their target, instead of running or turning to fight, climbed away from them at an angle that seemed physically impossible for such a heavy aircraft. The flight leader barked orders in German. His wingmen pushed their throttles forward, pulling their control sticks back to follow. The Bf-109 was lighter, more maneuverable, and had an excellent climb rate. On paper, they should have been able to follow Johnson easily, maybe even catch him. But something was wrong. The Thunderbolt wasn't slowing down. It wasn't stalling. It was climbing faster than they were, and the gap was widening. One of the German pilots, his voice tight with frustration, radioed back to the flight leader. The transmission was recorded by Allied listening posts, later translated. "He's climbing away from us. I can't match his angle. He's gaining altitude faster than we are." The flight leader didn't believe it. He pushed his own aircraft harder, feeling the airframe shudder as the Bf-109 struggled to maintain the steep climb angle. But the American fighter kept pulling away, higher and higher, its massive bulk somehow defying gravity itself. The physics of the impossible. Here's where this story gets technical, but stay with me because this is where you understand exactly how impossible what Johnson was doing actually was. The P-47 Thunderbolt had something that no other fighter in the world could match in 1945, an absolutely insane power-to-weight ratio at altitude, combined with a supercharger system that was borderline magical. Most people think lighter aircraft climb better. That's true at low altitude, but at high altitude, everything changes. The air gets thinner, engines lose power because there's less oxygen to burn fuel, propellers lose efficiency because there's less air to bite into. Most fighters at 25,000 feet are gasping, struggling, operating at maybe 60 or 70% of their sea level power. But the P-47 had a turbo-supercharger that was so efficient, so well designed, that it could actually maintain full power all the way up to 30,000 feet. In some conditions, it actually performed better at high altitude than it did at sea level. The German Bf-109 pilots chasing Johnson didn't understand this. Their aircraft were excellent performers up to about 20,000 feet, but above that, they started to suffer. Their engines wheezed, their climb rate dropped, and the higher they went, the worse it got. Johnson knew all of this. He had studied his aircraft manual like it was a religious text. He knew that if he could get above 30,000 feet, the physics of the situation would shift entirely in his favor. So he kept climbing. The altimeter spun like a clock on fast forward. 24,000 feet, 26,000, 28,000. The German fighters were still following, but they were falling behind now. Not by a little, by a lot. Their climb angle had decreased. They were wallowing, struggling, their engines sputtering in the thin air. Johnson's radio, which could pick up German frequencies if they were close enough, crackled with increasingly frantic transmissions. Another German pilot, his voice edged with panic now, reported back to his leader, "I cannot maintain this climb. He's moving away too fast. This isn't possible." The flight leader, clearly frustrated, ordered his pilots to spread out, to try to cut off Johnson's escape route if he turned. But Johnson wasn't turning. He was still climbing, straight up, like a rocket heading for space. At 31,000 feet, something incredible happened. Johnson leveled off, just for a moment, and looked down. Below him, scattered across several thousand feet of vertical space, the 11 German fighters were struggling. Some had given up the climb and were circling, trying to regain their composure. Others were still trying to follow, but were losing altitude even as they fought to climb. And that's when Johnson made his next move. He didn't run away to the west, toward Allied lines. Instead, he rolled inverted, pointed his nose down, and dove straight at the German formation. The Thunderbolt in a dive was a terrifying thing. It could exceed 500 miles per hour without breaking apart. Some pilots had pushed them past 550. Johnson plummeted toward the confused German fighters like a falling anvil, his 850 caliber machine guns loaded and ready. The German pilots scattered in panic. They had been the hunters seconds ago. Now they were prey, and they knew it. Johnson didn't even fire. He didn't need to. He blasted through their formation at a speed that made interception impossible. The sheer violence of his dive scattering them like leaves in a hurricane. And then, using the energy from that dive, he pulled up again. Hard. G-forces crushed him into his seat as the Thunderbolt arced upward, converting speed into altitude with brutal efficiency. He climbed again. And the Germans, now completely disorganized, tried to regroup and follow. The radio transmissions that shocked command. This is where the historical record gets really interesting, because we have the actual German radio transmissions from this engagement, captured and translated by Allied intelligence. These aren't dramatized. These are real words from real pilots who were experiencing something that shattered their understanding of what was possible. At 33,000 feet, Johnson had climbed again, and the German flight leader was done pretending this was going according to plan. His transmission, recorded by a British listening post in Belgium, was sharp and disbelieving. "He is above above us again. Every time we attempt to close, he outclimbs us. The American aircraft should not be capable of this performance. Another pilot, younger, less experienced, asked the question everyone was thinking. Should we disengage? We cannot catch him. There was a long pause. German fighter doctrine in 1945 was aggressive. Never let an enemy bomber or fighter escape if you had numerical superiority. But doctrine was written for situations that made sense. This didn't make sense. The flight leader made a decision that probably saved his pilots' lives. All aircraft descend to 20,000 feet. We'll intercept him if he attempts to cross back to Allied territory at lower altitude. It was a reasonable tactical call. Johnson would have to come down eventually. He couldn't stay at oxygen-starved altitudes forever, and he certainly couldn't land at 30,000 feet. The Germans would wait below, spread out in a net, and catch him when he descended. Except Johnson had already thought 3 moves ahead. He had been watching his fuel gauge the entire time. He had maybe 20 minutes left. Not enough to make it back to friendly territory if he had to dogfight at low altitude, but plenty if he stayed high and fast. So he did something that the German pilots weren't anticipating. He leveled off at 34,000 feet, pointed his nose west, and engaged his cruise settings. The Thunderbolt, at high altitude with minimal maneuvering, was incredibly fuel efficient. At that altitude, he could cruise at over 300 miles per hour while burning fuel at a rate that gave him just enough range to reach Allied lines. The German fighters below him tried to parallel his course, staying underneath, waiting for him to descend. But Johnson never descended. He stayed high, unreachably high. The British listening post picked up another transmission, this one from a different German pilot. The frustration was palpable. He's not coming down. He's maintaining altitude and speed. We're burning fuel trying to stay with him, and he's pulling away. The flight leader's response was clipped, almost defeated. Break off pursuit. Return to base. Just like that, it was over. 11 of Germany's veteran fighter pilots, in excellent aircraft, with every advantage except altitude performance, had been defeated by a single American pilot who understood his machine better than they understood theirs. But the story doesn't end there, because what Johnson did next cemented this moment as one of the most audacious acts of aerial combat in the entire war. The impossible decision. Johnson could have headed straight for Allied lines. He was safe. The Germans had broken off. He had enough fuel to make it back if he flew conservatively. But he looked down at his map, did some quick mental calculations, and realized something. He was almost directly over a German airfield that Allied intelligence had been trying to locate for weeks. It was a reserve base, hidden in the hills, used to stage fighters and supply aircraft away from the main strategic bombing routes. Finding it had been a priority, and here it was, right below him. He had 2 choices: fly home safe, report the location, and let Bomber Command deal with it in a few days, or do something absolutely insane. Johnson checked his ammunition. He had fired maybe 50 rounds during the entire engagement, just a quick burst to scatter one group of Germans who got too close during his second climb. He was still fully armed, 8 guns, over 3,000 rounds remaining, and he was at 34,000 feet, directly above an enemy airbase, with no German fighters in a position to intercept him. He rolled the Thunderbolt inverted again and pushed the stick forward. The dive was even more violent this time because he started from higher altitude. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, past 450, past 500. The controls went stiff as the air resistance built up. The whole aircraft shook and roared like it was trying to tear itself apart. Johnson didn't care. He kept the dive steep, pointing straight at the airfield below. The German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground had about 15 seconds of warning. They heard the scream of the dive before they saw the aircraft. By the time they spotted the Thunderbolt, it was too late. Johnson leveled out at 2,000 feet, traveling at over 500 miles per hour, and opened fire. All 8 guns. The effect was catastrophic. The 50 caliber rounds, each one powerful enough to punch through engine blocks, stitched across parked aircraft, fuel trucks, and ammunition storage buildings. Explosions blossomed across the airfield. Aircraft that had been safely parked minutes ago were now shredded hulks. A fuel depot detonated with a fireball that climbed hundreds of feet into the air. Johnson held the trigger for exactly 4 seconds. That's all it took. 4 seconds of sustained fire from 8 heavy machine guns traveling at 500 miles per hour. He released the trigger, pulled up hard, and climbed again. The G-forces were brutal, probably close to 7 or 8 Gs, enough to gray out most pilots. But Johnson had done this before. He tensed his legs and core, fought to keep blood in his brain, and kept pulling. The Thunderbolt arced upward, away from the airfield, away from the anti-aircraft fire that was just just now starting to track him. He climbed back to 25,000 feet, throttled back to cruise power, and pointed west. Behind him, the German airfield was burning. Ahead of him, Allied territory was 20 minutes away. He had just enough fuel, barely. The radio transmission that reached Allied command 30 minutes later was brief. Johnson's voice, calm and professional despite what he had just been through. "This is Jug 27. Engaged and evaded 11 enemy fighters. Located and attacked enemy reserve airfield at coordinates follow. Returning to base. Fuel critical." The intelligence officer who took that transmission thought it was a joke at first. 1 pilot, 11 enemies, a successful airfield attack. It sounded like propaganda, not a combat report. The landing and immediate aftermath. Johnson's Thunderbolt crossed into Allied airspace with the fuel gauge reading below empty. The engine was running on fumes and willpower. He had radioed ahead to the nearest friendly airfield, a forward base in Belgium that was primarily used for emergency landings and quick refueling. The tower cleared him for immediate landing. No pattern, no waiting, straight in. As he descended through 8,000 feet, the engine coughed. Once, twice. Johnson's hand was already on the landing gear lever. He had seconds, maybe. The gear came down. The flaps extended. He was gliding now, the propeller windmilling uselessly as the engine died completely. The runway appeared ahead. A strip of pierced steel planking laid across frozen mud. It wasn't pretty, but it would work. Johnson lined up perfectly, using every bit of his experience to manage the unpowered descent. The Thunderbolt touched down hard, the tires barking against the metal planking, and rolled to a stop about 2/3 of the way down the runway. Silence. The engine was dead. The fuel tanks were dry. Johnson sat in the cockpit for a long moment, breathing hard, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline come-down. Ground crew were already running toward the aircraft, expecting damage, expecting injuries. What they found instead was a Thunderbolt that looked almost untouched. A few scratches from debris during the low-level strafing run. Nothing structural, nothing serious. Johnson climbed out of the cockpit, accepted a canteen of water from a mechanic, and asked where the intelligence office was. He had a report to file. Within an hour, his combat report was being radioed to 8th Air Force headquarters in England. The details seemed impossible. The duty officer who received it flagged it for immediate verification. They pulled the radio intercept logs from the British listening post. They matched Johnson's timeline perfectly. The German transmissions about an enemy fighter climbing away, outperforming their Bf-109s, refusing to descend. It was all there. They contacted Johnson directly via radio telephone. A colonel asked him to confirm specific details: the altitude, the number of enemy aircraft, the attack on the airfield. Johnson confirmed everything, his voice steady and factual. There was no embellishment, no heroic language. Just a pilot reporting what had happened. The colonel was silent for a moment, then said something that Johnson would remember for the rest of his life. "Lieutenant, what you've just described shouldn't be possible. The performance you're claiming from the P-47 exceeds every specification we have on record. If we didn't have the German radio intercepts to confirm it, I wouldn't believe it." Johnson's response was simple. "Sir, I didn't exceed any specifications. I just flew the aircraft exactly the way it was designed to be flown. The Germans didn't know what a Thunderbolt could do at high altitude. I did." That response was included in the official after-action report. Within 24 hours, Johnson's engagement was being analyzed by aeronautical engineers, tactical planning officers, and training command instructors. Because if one pilot could use the P-47's high-altitude performance to escape and defeat 11 enemy fighters, that meant the training programs needed to emphasize this capability more heavily. It meant tactical doctrine needed to be updated. It meant every Thunderbolt pilot in the European theater needed to understand what their aircraft was truly capable of when pushed to its absolute limits. The reconnaissance photos of the German airfield came back 3 days later. The damage was extensive. 7 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 2 fuel storage facilities burned out. 1 ammunition dump detonated. The airfield was listed as non-operational for at least 2 weeks, all from a 4-second strafing run by a single fighter that was supposed to have been shot down by 11 enemy interceptors. The German after-action reports, captured after the war, tell the other side of the story. The flight leader who had led the intercept was reprimanded, not for tactical failure, but for filing a report that his superiors initially didn't believe. He had claimed that an American P-47 outclimbed his entire squadron, maintained superior altitude performance, and escaped without taking any damage. His commanding officer accused him of exaggerating to cover for a failed intercept. It wasn't until other pilots corroborated the story and the radio transcripts were reviewed that the report was accepted accepted as accurate. The technical deep dive and historical impact. So let's talk about why this was possible. Because the engineering behind the P-47 Thunderbolt is absolutely fascinating and explains everything that happened that day. The key to the whole thing was the turbo-supercharger system, and this is genuinely one of the most brilliant pieces of engineering from the entire war. Most fighters in World War II used mechanical superchargers, basically air compressors driven directly by the engine through gears. They worked well at low altitude, but became less efficient as you climbed because they were stealing power from the engine to run the compressor. The P-47 used a different system entirely. It had a turbo-supercharger, which was driven by exhaust gases from the engine. Basically, the hot exhaust spun a turbine, which drove the compressor, which forced more air into the engine. The beauty of this system was that it didn't steal any power from the engine itself. It was using energy that would have been wasted anyway. And the higher you went, the more efficiently it worked, because the pressure differential between the exhaust and the thin outside air increased. This meant the P-47 could maintain full power, 2,400 horsepower, all the way up to about 30,000 feet. Meanwhile, a Bf-109 at 30,000 feet was making maybe 1,200 horsepower, less than half. The P-47 was also heavier, which actually helped in this situation. More weight means more inertia, which means more energy to work with during climbs and dives. When Johnson pulled out of his dives and converted that speed into altitude, the Thunderbolt's mass helped it carry momentum upward more efficiently than a lighter fighter could. The German pilots were fighting physics, and they didn't even realize it. Their training, their experience, their tactical doctrine, all of it was based on aircraft performance at medium altitudes where their fighters excelled. Nobody had taught them what to do when an enemy fighter could outperform them at high altitude, because in their experience, that had never happened before. The Bf-109 was an excellent aircraft. The pilots were skilled and experienced, but they were using the wrong tool for the job, and by the time they realized it, Johnson was already gone. The impact of this engagement rippled through both Allied and German tactical planning. On the Allied side, training programs for P-47 pilots were updated to emphasize high-altitude performance and the specific techniques Johnson had used. The concept of using vertical maneuvers, climbs and dives to defeat numerically superior enemies became a core part of Thunderbolt tactics. Pilots were taught to think three-dimensionally, to use altitude as both a weapon and a shield. On the German side, the engagement contributed to a growing sense of technological disadvantage. By early 1945, German pilots were increasingly aware that Allied aircraft had performance advantages in specific scenarios, and this engagement was a perfect example. It also highlighted the fuel problem Germany was facing. The Bf-109s that chased Johnson burned through a significant amount of fuel trying to match his climb rate. They landed back at their base with reserves that were dangerously low. In a military where every liter of aviation fuel was precious and increasingly scarce, that kind of waste was devastating. There's also a psychological component that can't be ignored. German fighter pilots in 1945 were under enormous stress. They were outnumbered, often outgunned, and facing increasingly experienced Allied pilots. An engagement like this one, where 11 experienced pilots couldn't even touch a single enemy fighter, was demoralizing. It reinforced the feeling that the war was lost, that no amount of skill or courage could overcome the material and technological advantages the Allies had built up. The legacy and lessons that changed aviation. Robert Johnson landed back at his home base 2 days after the engagement, after his Thunderbolt had been refueled and inspected at the forward airfield in Belgium. He was expecting a quiet return, maybe a brief acknowledgement from his squadron commander. Instead, he found a delegation of officers waiting for him, including a general from 8th Air Force Command. The general shook his hand and told him that his combat report had been forwarded all the way up to General Eisenhower's staff. They wanted to interview him personally, to understand exactly what he had done and how he had done it. Over the next week, Johnson gave multiple presentations to groups of pilots, engineers, and tactical planners. He walked them through every decision, every maneuver, every calculation he had made during the engagement. He emphasized repeatedly that he hadn't done anything superhuman. He had simply understood his aircraft's capabilities and used them intelligently. The P-47 could outclimb German fighters at high altitude. That was a fact. The P-47 could sustain high-speed dives and convert that energy into climbs. That was a fact. The P-47 had excellent fuel efficiency at high altitude when flown correctly. That was a fact. Johnson had taken those facts and built a survival strategy around them. The presentations were recorded, transcribed, and distributed to every P-47 squadron in the European theater. Within a month, pilots across the 8th and 9th Air Forces were practicing the techniques Johnson had demonstrated. They were learning to think of altitude not as a simple tactical position, but as a resource to be managed and exploited. They were learning to use the Thunderbolt's unique characteristics, its weight, its power, its toughness, as advantages rather than limitations. The results were measurable. Loss rates for P-47 squadrons dropped, kill ratios improved. Pilots reported feeling more confident when engaging numerically superior enemies because they had a proven escape strategy if things went wrong. Johnson's engagement had given them a playbook for survival and success. Now here's where I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me what you think you would have done in Johnson's situation. 11 enemy fighters on your tail, low fuel, alone over enemy territory. Would you have tried to run? Would you have climbed like Johnson did? Would you have tried to fight your way through? I'm genuinely curious what your instinct would be. So hit that comment section and let me know. And while you're down there, make sure you've hit the like button too, because it helps more people discover these incredible stories. The story of Johnson's escape also reached Germany, but through very different channels. The pilots who had been involved in the failed intercept talked about it quietly among themselves. Word spread through the Jagdgeschwader units. There was a grudging respect for what the American pilot had achieved, mixed with frustration and a recognition that the technological balance of the war had shifted decisively. Some German pilots started referring to the P-47 as Der Himmelsramme, the Sky Ram, acknowledging its ability to climb and dive with devastating effectiveness. After the war, during interviews with captured German pilots, several mentioned the engagement. One pilot, whose name was recorded in the historical documents as Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, specifically talked about how encounters like Johnson's changed the way German pilots approached combat in the final months of the war. They became more cautious, more selective about when to engage. They couldn't afford to waste fuel chasing targets they couldn't catch. They couldn't afford to lose aircraft in encounters where they were technically outmatched. The psychological impact of knowing that even with numerical superiority they might not win was corrosive to morale. Johnson himself flew 19 more combat missions before the war ended in May 1945. He never faced a situation quite as desperate as that January engagement, but he used the same principles in every flight. Understand your aircraft. Use its strengths. Avoid fighting in ways that favor the enemy. He finished the war with 32 confirmed kills and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for the January 15th engagement. The citation specifically mentioned his extraordinary aerial skill and profound understanding of aircraft performance characteristics. After the war, Johnson stayed in the Air Force. He became a test pilot, then an instructor, then eventually a consultant for aircraft manufacturers. He was involved in the development of the F-86 Sabre, the first American swept-wing jet fighter. Engineers loved working with him because he could explain exactly what a pilot needed from an aircraft in combat, and he could do it in terms that made sense from both a tactical and engineering perspective. In the 1960s, he was asked to give a lecture at the Air Force Academy about his wartime experiences. He focused almost entirely on the January 15th engagement, not because it was the most dramatic thing he'd done, but because it illustrated the principle he thought was most important for young pilots to learn. Know your machine better than the enemy knows his, he told the cadets. Not just the numbers in the manual, the feel of it, the personality of it, what it can do when you ask everything from it. Because someday, that knowledge will save your life. That lecture was recorded and is still used in Air Force training programs today. The legacy of that single engagement on January 15, 1945, extends far beyond one pilot's survival. It changed tactical doctrine. It influenced aircraft design. It became a case study in how understanding performance characteristics can overcome numerical disadvantage. And it gave generations of pilots a template for how to think about aerial combat in 3 dimensions rather than 2. Conclusion and final reflection. So what's the real lesson here? Because this story isn't just about one incredible escape. It's about the intersection of engineering, knowledge, courage, and split split-second decision making under pressure that defines combat aviation. Robert Johnson survived and won against impossible odds because he had taken the time to truly understand his aircraft. Not just how to fly it, but how it worked, why it worked, and what it was capable of in extreme situations. The German pilots who chased him were skilled, experienced, and brave, but they were working with incomplete information. They assumed the P-47 was just another heavy fighter, tough but slow, powerful but clumsy. They didn't know about the turbo-supercharger performance curve. They didn't know about the high-altitude capabilities. And by the time they figured it out, Johnson was already beyond their reach. This is a pattern you see throughout military history. Technological advantages matter, but only if the people using the technology understand it well enough to exploit those advantages. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been in service for years before Johnson's engagement. Hundreds of pilots had flown it in combat. But Johnson was one of the few who had really studied what made it special, what made it different, and how to use those differences to survive. There's also something deeply human about this story that I think gets lost sometimes in the technical details and tactical analysis. Johnson was 23 years old. 23. Most people at that age are figuring out their first real job, trying to pay rent, wondering what they want to do with their lives. Johnson was alone over Nazi Germany, being hunted by 11 enemy fighters, making calculations about fuel consumption and climb rates, while pulling G-forces that would make most people pass out. And he didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He thought his way through the problem, step by step, using knowledge and skill to overcome a situation that should have been fatal. That level of composure under pressure is something you can't really teach. You can train people. You can educate them. You can give them the tools and knowledge they need, but the ability to actually use all of that when your life is on the line, when every decision matters, and there's no time to second-guess yourself, that's something rare and special. The intercepted German radio transmissions from that day are preserved in military archives, and they're haunting to read. You can hear the confusion turning to frustration, turning to disbelief, as these experienced pilots realize they can't catch their target. He's climbing away. We can't match him. That single sentence, captured on a scratchy radio recording 80 years ago, tells you everything you need to know about how completely Johnson dominated that engagement. He turned the hunters into spectators. He made them question their own abilities and their aircraft, and then, just to make the point absolutely clear, he attacked their airfield on the way home. The audacity of that decision still amazes me. Most pilots would have been thrilled just to escape. Johnson escaped and then went on offense. That takes a level of confidence and tactical awareness that's almost superhuman. But again, it comes back to knowledge. He knew he had the altitude. He knew he had the ammunition. He knew where the airfield was. He knew the Germans couldn't intercept him if he stayed high and fast. So he made the call that maximized the impact of his mission. That's not recklessness. That's calculated aggression based on perfect understanding of the tactical situation. Before we wrap this up, I want you to do two more things for me. First, share this video with anyone you know who's interested in military history, aviation, or just incredible stories of human courage and ingenuity. These stories deserve to be remembered and passed on, and the only way that happens is if people like you share them. Second, tell me in the comments what other World War II stories you want to hear about. I've got a whole list of incredible accounts. Pilots, soldiers, sailors, civilians, people who did things that seem impossible but actually happened. Your comments help me figure out what to cover next. So don't be shy. Tell me what you want to know about. Robert Johnson passed away in 1998 at the age of 78. He lived a long life after the war, raised a family, had a successful career, and was recognized as one of the great fighter aces of World War II. But when interviewers asked him about his wartime experiences, he almost always came back to that January day in 1945. Not because it was the most dramatic or the most dangerous thing he did, but because it was the perfect example of what he believed about aviation and combat. Skill matters. Knowledge matters. Understanding your tools matters. And when you combine all of those things with courage and clear thinking, you can accomplish things that seem impossible. That Thunderbolt Johnson flew that day, the one that climbed away from 11 German fighters and then attacked an enemy airfield before gliding to a dead stick landing on empty tanks, that aircraft survived the war. It was eventually brought back to the United States and sat in storage for decades. In the 1980s, it was restored and is now on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. If you ever get a chance to visit, go see it. Stand next to it. Look at how big it is, how heavy, how brutal, and then imagine being alone at 34,000 feet in that machine, being chased by 11 enemies, and deciding that the best move is to climb even higher. That's the story of Robert Johnson, and the day he turned physics, engineering, and pure courage into one of the most legendary escapes in aviation history. Thanks for watching. I'm Wasim Rind, and I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share. These stories matter, and I'm honored to tell them to you.